For more on this story, we can bring in Fiona Macaulay, Senior Lecturer in Development Studies at the University of Bradford. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program today. Is this a done deal for the far right in Brazil?
I think it would be extremely difficult for them to be defeated at this point if one were to look at the previous 4 or 5 elections. If you're ahead in the first round, it's quite likely that he will win. Now, this is a surprise to everybody. I don't think that any of the polls in advance of the election showed Bolsonaro gaining 46% in the first round. I think it would take an incredible effort of unity for the centre and the centre-left to stop Bolsonaro in his tracks, because he's clearly got enormous impetus at the moment. And he's got some really key supporters, namely the churches, the neo-Pentecostal evangelical churches, and this wave of dissatisfaction with the system. And unfortunately, the PT and the PSDB, the other more traditional parties that have ruled in Brazil, are seen as the system. So this is a wave of anti-system sentiment, and I would not be surprised if he won in the second round.
Now, you're saying this is a result of anti-system sentiment, yet the former jailed president, Lula da Silva, remains popular with voters. So why is it then that the candidate handpicked by him is so unpopular?
Well, the PT, first of all, was in power for 14 years. And I think there's a certain anti-incumbency sentiment, which is to say, you know, the PT had their chance. They did a lot of good things. The fact that the northeast of Brazil voted largely for the PT and not for Bolsonaro is an indication of the economic policies that they put in place that raised income levels for poor families there. But there were other issues, and clearly the PT also governed through the system, which unfortunately in Brazil, because there are 30 parties now represented in Congress, to govern with 30 parties, you essentially need to pay them off and buy the votes to get your policies through in Congress. The PT didn't change that system. They bought into it. They used it. And the corruption scandals that have been exploding over the last few years have strongly implicated the PT. So a lot of this anti-system sentiment is very much targeted at the PT. There is also a lot of demonization of the PT, in which the center parties also engaged, unfortunately, claiming, you know, Brazil will become Venezuela if Haddad is elected, which is clearly nonsense. But the fact that that demonization stuck and convinced people is basically riding on some factual issues that the PT did not deliver. It governed through corrupt mechanisms. And also, you mentioned law and order in your report. And I think that no centrist government of the last 20 years has actually dealt with law and order and violence issues. And that, for many Brazilians, is a major source of insecurity. Now, I don't think Bolsonaro will actually reduce violence if he becomes president. I think violence will rise, but that's another issue.
What is it about Bolsonaro's campaign that is resonating with voters? Because, I mean, this is a man who is known for his hostility towards gay people in the country, refugees, ethnic minorities, the environment, the list goes on. Why are they suddenly attracted by his campaign?
Well, it's very interesting because he emerged from being a kind of fairly unknown, if notorious, backbencher without a party to forming a party and pulling lots of people together. Now, he has a very absolutist and moralizing discourse, and it's an us and them discourse. So one of the reasons that the churches have come on board, or some of them anyway, to support him is because he talks that language of good and evil, and he has really weaponized that language. So for him, there are good people who have rights, and then there are bad people, there are criminals who basically deserve to be shot on sight by the police. And unfortunately, the sentiments of a lot of Brazilians chimes in with that they kind of feel that there is an us and them, and that because they are so insecure in their employment, in their housing, their access to public services, fear of crime on the streets in their houses, all of that gets poured into one sort of central vessel. And Bolsonaro's promise, his messianic promise to save the country against all of these ills, is what is articulated here. And if I'm honest, you know, Brazil doesn't really, a lot of Brazilians don't really care about minority rights when they feel that their own basic needs are not being satisfied. And so the identity politics that is part of the left and the centre-left has been used against the left. Actually, this campaign was not about economics and job creation and new economic policies. It was targeted at people we dislike, groups that seem to symbolize everything that is wrong with the country. And it's very easy to mobilize that kind of us and then them sentiment.
Indeed it is. Fiona, Macaulay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.